Yeah, so today we're going to start the series about the Ten Commandments. Today we're going to talk about four of them, and then we're going to kind of slow down. And over the next 6 weeks after that, we're going to take each of the last six together as their own thing. At least that's what I think we're going to do. It may be too much. I mean, I may get to a point this morning where it's just, we just got to get done because there's a lot going on here. But how many commandments do we really need? Right? How many commandments do we actually need? I know some of you, right? Some of you folks out there were kind of yelling out some things that are really true, right? Some of you are aware of the fact that, you fast forward into the life and ministry of Jesus and the ethic under which we live, and he's like, hey, the whole law is boiled down to two commandments. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. As long as you do those two things, you've done everything. And the reality is, you could actually boil it all down to just the first commandment. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. If you loved God, if I loved God with all my heart, all my mind, all my soul, all my strength, I would love my neighbor as myself. I would already do that because it would reflect my love for God. So how many commandments do we need? I have, over the years, when I've done premarital counseling for folks that want to get married, one of the first assignments that I give to the future bride and groom is a commandment to come up with their 10 commandments. The 10 commandments for their marriage. It's really funny because, they come back to the next meeting, right? And usually the woman has this notebook, right, that she has brought with her. And, and the guy's just there like empty-handed. I'm like, all right, let's talk about the 10 commandments. If I look to the guy, it's like, what do you got? Like, dude, this is your chance right here. This is where you get to like lay out the law for your marriage, right? And then almost invariably, the woman, she's got her stuff very, very well organized. I had this one time, the couple came in and the girl, she followed the rules, like she stuck to the 10 commandments, but her 10 commandments were more like an outline. They're like 10 major points with bulleted subpoints, to further elaborate on what those 10 commandments are. So how many commandments do we really need? Aren't there just the two, right? The two that we talked about. Love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I think that for us to dive back into the 10 commandments, it could be very, very helpful. Because yes, while the reality is we live under this ethic to love God and love our neighbor, right? As absolutely true as that is, sometimes we could use a little help describing, okay, well, what does that look like? What does that mean? It's really easy for me to make the claim that I'm loving God with all my heart. It's very easy for me to just make the claim, oh yeah, I treat other people the way I want to be treated. I love my neighbor as myself. But the question is, and I think what we really want to look at is we're taking a fresh look at the 10 commandments, right? Fresh look at the first 10. Am I really living, to what extent am I living these out? How could I maybe live these things out better? I want you to know, we're not doing this to make anybody feel guilty, okay? This isn't so that, by the time we get to the end of the service, like everybody's just kind of like at their heads down and they're writing a bigger check to put in the offering, right? To make up for all the ways in which we failed at living up to the 10 commandments. This isn't to point out everything that's wrong with you and with me. I think that, if we really pay attention, we'll actually discover over the course of our time together that what we're talking about, it may have been written, right? It may be the written law of God, but the reality is, if we look really carefully, I think we'll find that it's written on our hearts, right? These things that we talked about, I think we'll find that, wow, these are, if I live out these commandments for my life, these are actually the best way for me to live my life. So let's look at them. We're going to start, we're just going to take these first four one at a time. So I'm in Exodus chapter 20, and I want to read verses 1 and 2, okay, which give us the first command. Exodus 20, verses 1 and 2. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. So God here, before he gets into the 10 words that he is going to give as commands for his people, just a little resume, just a reminder of, who it is that is issuing this proclamation, right? He identifies himself as the Lord. I am the Lord, your God, okay? Almost, like the reason why you, like if God's speaking to his people, the reason why you ought to listen to me is because I am your God, you're my people, right? We talked about that over the last few weeks in our last series, right? I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, right? God, he redeemed his people and he made this people his own, right? And now he's going to give them a guidebook as to like how are we going to live in covenant with one another. God had made some tremendous promises to his people, right? But how many of you know a covenant works in two directions, right? The two parties that have entered into covenant with one another, in order for that covenant to actually work, like both parties have to live up to what are their responsibilities. And God, as God, is basically saying, here are your responsibilities. Number one, do not have other gods besides me. Do not have other gods besides me. So that's the first commandment that he gives us. Do not have other gods besides me. Let me tell you something about us, okay? Which you may or may not believe this. You may or may not agree with this, but I believe, and I'm sure most of you here believe, that we have an instinct to know and worship God. That it is instinctual in us to want to know God and to worship him. Certainly that is evidenced by the people that gather together in places of worship like we have today and throughout the world. It's reflected in the quest for elevating a sense of spirituality among those perhaps that may not even believe particularly the same things that Christians believe, but it does show some measure of the commonality of this desire to know God, to know this other thing, and even to worship it, right? That seems instinctual to us. Even the person who has rejected God, like the person who regards himself or herself as a staunch atheist with no room whatsoever for the possibility that there is some supernatural being or power that is responsible for having created all of this, even that person, right, is looking to find purpose in the universe, trying to figure out what is the meaning of all this. And if they've gone so far as to simply disregard even the possibility that there is meaning and purpose, like so materialistic is the view of their existence that it's like, well, this is all just some big cosmic accident and there really is no meaning and purpose. Even that person is at least still looking for an explanation, right? Trying to leverage science and a growing knowledge and awareness of things in order to at least understand, okay, well, if there's no reason for why we're here, maybe there could still be an explanation for how we are here, right? So we have this instinct to know and worship God. Now, here's the problem, right? And this is where something like religion, something like Christianity begins to speak into what many of us already recognize is a feature of our created selves, right? Christianity would suggest that while we all have the instinct to know God and worship God, something broke, right? The ability to know God as he is, the ability to worship God in the fullness that we were designed to worship him in, it's been broken, right? That the fullness of God is now hidden from us. It's been obscured in some way. And so now we have to look for him. Some of you would describe your life as a life that has spent some time, perhaps considerable time, looking for God, looking to discover more about God, right? Trying to satisfy this desire, this hunger, this thirst to know God, right? That's been a feature of your life, right? Some people would testify to that. We have to look for him. Now, we don't have to look for him because he's hiding. We're not, like he's intentionally trying to keep himself away from us. We have to look for him because of what's broken. He's not trying to make it difficult for us. In fact, I believe the Bible tells us he isn't even that hard to find. It might be something like, when you lose your car keys, right? And you're looking for your car keys. And what you know is, well, I know my keys are here somewhere, right? Doesn't that make the search for your car keys a little easier, right? I know for certain that they're here. I don't know exactly where they are, but I know they're here, so I can somewhat conclude that I will find them. Now, it might require some time and some frustration and some effort. It might even require the assistance of some other people. Maybe, perhaps you have to just retrace your steps, think back to when you last had your keys, right? Sometimes in our searching for God, not only is there a requirement for us to move forward, sometimes every once in a while we have to move backward to get back to the place where we had veered off the path, right? But God here, he issues this commandment, don't have any other gods besides me. Now, depending on the Bible that you're using, the language here might be translated in one of a couple ways. Some of you might have, if you've been in church for a long time, you might have memorized this commandment in a different translation than where it says, have no other gods besides me. Like it might say, and some of you would quote, this first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me, right? How many would say that's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind? Before, beside, right? There's a little ambiguity in exactly how you would translate, right? Because the word that was used here could convey either one of those meanings. But besides me, like in the translation we used this morning, is probably a better way to understand the command than before me. When we think about the command is this, don't have any other gods before me, we almost think as if there's some hierarchy, right, that we're supposed to follow, that it's in fact okay to have other gods just so long as none of those gods come before us. And you'll often hear this, you'll hear this in sermons, you'll hear this in Christian talk, kind of all over the place when we talk about things like, putting God first and not having any idols in our lives, right? All these things, the emphasis is on making God first. But I think what's important for us to understand that is if the idea here really is that God is saying to his people, do not have any other gods besides me, right? That he is in essence saying you are to have no other gods at all. Right? That it's not just about simply, making sure that I am the chief God of all your gods, but that you are to have no gods at all whatsoever other than me. Now, this would have been this would have had great contrast between what was the cultural norm for the people who listened to this. Right? The cultural norm was to allow really any number of gods. And there was, within the nations surrounding in Israel, and even in the experience of Israel, God's people themselves, oftentimes there was this hierarchy that existed in their God. Now, God might have had first place, but it didn't necessarily exclude the idea of some other God. But God here, I think, is emphasizing the fact that what he wants is he wants an exclusive relationship. Do not have any other gods besides me speaks to the exclusivity by which God wants our relationship with him to be defined. Now, we trespass this command, in our lives, in our common experience, by doing things like fabricating alternative versions of who God is. Or how many of you have done this? Putting ourselves first, like making ourselves our own God in place of him, right? And so God here, he starts this whole thing out with, do not have any other gods besides me. I think Jesus had something to teach about this commandment. Sounds a little different, but let's look and see one of the things that Jesus said when it came to the gods of our lives. I'm looking at Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Jesus said this. This is Jesus. Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. No one can serve two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So here Jesus is using the illustration, right, that you have on the one hand God, and on the other hand another kind of God, in this particular case the God of money. And Jesus says you can't serve both of them. You cannot serve two masters. How many of you out there would consider yourselves as being able to do multiple things at the same time, right? Like you can handle all kinds of tasks. You can multitask with the best. Anybody like that out there? Right? Well, when it comes to our relationship with God, there's no multitasking allowed. There's no idea that that God can be God while there are at the same time these other competing gods in my life. Jesus says you can't do it. You can't serve God and money, right? There's a binary here. There's one or the other. And so I think what you and I really ought to understand is that we should be thinking less about ranking our gods, right? Because that's most often what we try to do. We don't even do a good job of it, right? But it's like, oh yeah, I put God first, right? I put my family second and work third, and this and that, all that, right? And so we almost think about the priorities of our lives as having this structure, right, where we give words to the idea that God's first, right? Because that's super easy to say, God's first. But I think that we need to think less about ranking our gods, because to allow another God in my life is spiritual adultery, right? This is going to sound a little extreme, but the Bible uses this language a lot to describe a people who are gods moving away from him and accepting other gods into their lives, into the sphere of worship. God himself describes that as spiritual adultery. When people, specifically the people of God, right, who committed this infraction again and again and again, when it says that they began serving the gods of other nations, right, or worshiping the gods of some of the surrounding areas, it doesn't mean that they utterly walked away from and abandoned the one true God. Truth be told, they probably kept the God who delivered them out of Israel, out of bondage, right? The God who issued these commands. They probably allowed for him to remain prominent as their national God, while at the same time they began worshiping these other, what we would describe as false gods. And God said, no, that's spiritual adultery, right? It's not just about abandoning God, about walking away from God. It's about allowing other gods into our lives that compete with where God wants to be. Well, do we do this? Probably. If we've said things like, I'll pay more attention to God when I'm finally working the job that I've wanted, right, that I'm working for, that I'm working toward. When we have this mindset, well, I'll pay more attention to God when I have my business where it needs to be, right? I have to give so much time and attention to my business, but once I get that situated, then that'll free me up to pay more attention to God at that point. I'll pay more attention to God when my kids get older, right? Just life is so busy and I'm running ragged from here to there and everywhere, right? Because of all the activities that we're engaged in as a family. But when my kids get older, then I'll have time to pay more attention to God. I'll pay more attention to God when my house is finished. After I get these projects done, I'll pay more attention to God when I'm not so busy, right? For those of us living here in the beautiful state of Maine, I'll pay more attention to God this summer when ski season is over, right? But then, of course, summer comes, right? And I'll pay more attention to God this winter when vacation season, when lake season is over, right? And so a lot of times, we let these other gods creep into our lives, and we fool ourselves into thinking that we're maintaining the priority like we ought to, when it's not even really about the priority. It's about the exclusive nature that God wants in his relationship with us, right? So the conclusion I think that we can probably draw from this commandment as it pertains to our lives is that God must be, that God wants to be, and he must be at the center of our lives. I think that's probably a better way to describe the priority that God deserves in our lives. That if we're to obey the command to have no other gods besides God, he has got to be at the center around which everything else revolves. We've sung the song over the years, "This is the air I breathe, your holy presence living in me. This is my daily bread, your very word spoken to me, and I'm desperate for you." I wonder, do we live our days with the sense, with the idea of how desperate we are for God, to the degree that we are desperate for the very air that we suck into our lungs, that we are desperate for the food we take into to satisfy the hunger of our bodies? Nor is God just this kind of casual throw-in, or even this angel or star at the top of the Christmas tree that's just kind of an adornment, a decoration for our lives. Listen, every one of us here is worshiping something. Every one of us is worshiping something. You say, "I don't even believe in God." You're worshiping something. It doesn't matter. Every one of us here is worshiping something. Every one of us is serving something. There's no way around it. And so the question is, what is yours? Who is yours? Have no other gods besides me. Second commandment, jumping down to verse 4. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down and worship to them, and do not serve them. Right? So this is a commandment that has to do with worshiping idols, right? And so most of us here today are going to just breathe a sigh of relief. Whew. Boy, that first one was a tough one, was it not? Can I get an amen? It was a tough one. Come on, let's just, we're all in this together here, right? That first one was a tough one. But, idols. Who has a problem with idols? Anybody? We'll just skip over it, right? Right? Idols aren't a problem for us. Why would anyone ever even want to make an idol and worship it? Right? That sounds so like ancient and superstitious. Certainly, for people that are as smart as we are, for people that are, that have evolved socially and intelligently as we have, we would never, ever, ever, fall into something so simplistic and may we call it silly as idol worship. Now, I need us to remember something, that we were made to worship, right? So why would people ever make idols and worship them? We got to remember what we said at the beginning here. We were created to worship. That is an instinctual part of us. It's built into our instincts. Now, people, I think, for all of time and history, have recognized that there's a chasm, there's a gap between themselves and their God or their gods. Right? There's been this recognition that while there is this something that is other than we are, something that is different and distinct from us that we may not be able to see or feel or hear or touch, right? This something that is in this, existing in this other realm. What idols did was idols served as a sort of mediator between our world and the world of the gods. right? It became this tangible expression of what we had no access to. It became a way, or this in-between, this mediator between the world of our physical experience and that world of the God or the gods. Now, when you really get down to it, what idols did was they gave power to the people, right? Idols allowed for people to feel like they had some power to control all kinds of different things, right? Idols made it possible for people to manipulate gods to do their bidding, right? I mean, we are familiar with the histories of how peoples, cultures would chant, some particular incantation, right? Or perform some kind of ceremony, or perhaps even offer some particular sacrifice in order to appease, read into that, manipulate their God into doing what they wanted, right? Like to ensure that the rains were sufficient for there to be a good harvest, right? For the certain weather features to, be on our side as opposed to working against us, for our benefit, for our prosperity. Now, what's interesting is, as we're talking about the fact that the idols gave power to the people, it allowed the people to feel some sense of control, here's kind of how it worked. If the incantation worked, if the ceremony worked, if the sacrifice worked, then credit could be claimed for the effort that was put into any one of those things, right? And if it didn't work, right, then the people had the power to make another sacrifice, to chant another incantation, right? To have another ceremony. It was all about effort. It was all about what we could do to make what we wanted to happen. It was all about effort. And so an idol put you in control. An idol gave you the frame of mind, it gave you the sense that while this God or these gods that you worshiped and served might exist in a sphere altogether different from the sphere in which we live, and we may not have direct access to them, there is a way, there is a means by which perhaps we might manipulate them. Now, God stands in stark contrast to the idea of that kind of God that can be manipulated, or that kind of God that can be controlled. Let me read from you for Isaiah, one of the prophets of the Old Testament. This is God speaking and describing himself in relation to us. Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. He says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. This is the Lord's declaration. For as heaven is higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." We like to think that our thoughts and God's thoughts are so closely aligned that they could barely be distinguished from one another, right? Have any of you ever imagined how God ought to do something, or how something ought to go, or how something ought to be? But as you grow, as you mature, you maybe discover that there are things that happen in our lives for which there seems to be little to no explanation, like what's going on there. The more that you discover the God that we gather together and worship every Sunday, just how higher he is, his thoughts, his ways from ours, what we understand is that the problem with an idol is an idol makes God too small, right? An idol takes something that is infinite, something that is eternal, something that is timeless, something that is altogether different from what we are. And it takes that very, very big, not just big, but infinitely big thing, and it makes it way too small. To try to describe God in some ways, is almost like me trying to work with a sketch artist, right? After I, maybe witnessed a violent crime, which would be terrible. Last person you want working with a sketch artist is this guy. Some years ago, our best friends, they had a baby. And this was like before the days of, cell phones where you're always, constant communication, texting one another. And they had decided that they weren't going to find out, like, if they were having a boy or a girl. And so they had their baby, and I got the call. I was at work. And so when I got home that day, I said to Renee, I said, Mark and Linda, they had their baby. And what did she ask? What'd they have? I didn't know. I couldn't remember, right? Like you don't want this guy working with a sketch artist. I mean, that would be a terrible thing for me trying to relive and figure out how to portray, from my mind to another person's hand what this person looked like. And sometimes, the task of describing God can almost feel like that, right? Idols make God too small. Idolatry focuses us on something much smaller than who God is. There's a sense in which, God is practically indescribable, right? That there's no way in which we can actually fully and completely encapsulate all who God is. We may make God too small when we try to contain him with our imagination. When there are characteristics that we know are true about God. There are things that God has revealed to us that allow us to know who God is because he has been willing to share them with us. But the tendency of human beings so many times is to emphasize some particular characteristic that they happen to be fond of in the moment to the exclusion of another characteristic that in their mind maybe competes with that. Don't we see it happen all the time where all people want to talk about is the love of God, and they altogether forget about the holiness of God? And it has happened, again, throughout the history of mankind and for as long as religion has been around, for people to want to emphasize and talk about the holiness of God while altogether forgetting about the love and the mercy and the grace of God. These things in our minds sometimes seem to be in opposition toward and competing with one another, but they're not. Within God, they are all perfectly united and characteristic of who he is. So idols make God too small. The other problem with idols is that idols can, and this sort of speaks to kind of this other possibility, idolatry can also make God too ambiguous. Right? There's a sense in which, as soon as we allow for idols to be a part of our experience, we get to this place where we can make an idol out of anything. Right? That's why God said, don't make any idols, that represent what is above the earth or on the earth or below the sea. Don't make idols of anything. Don't bow down to them. Don't worship them. Right? Because the reality is, for as many people as we have in this room, we can have at least that many different versions of who God is. And so God can, through idolatry, become some ambiguous character. But God isn't ambiguous. You know who God is? God is who he is, regardless of what you want to think about him or what I want to think about him. Regardless of how even, the 5 brightest and most creative people in this room get together in a room somewhere and come up with all their ideas and create this composite of who God is. No, it's not about what we think God is or what we want God to be. God's not ambiguous. God is who he is. But we've made gods of all kinds of things in our idolatry. Money can be an idol. Stuff can be an idol. Sex can be an idol. Your job can be an idol. Your marriage can be an idol. Someone else's marriage can be an idol. Your kids can be an idol. Someone else's kids can be an idol. Next time you watch a movie, watch the movie and think about, what is the God that is being portrayed in this movie? I can almost guarantee you that some God is being portrayed. Some God is being appealed to through the drama of that movie. Renee and I, we went and saw Avatar, finally. Always late to the party. So we saw Avatar this week. You know, in Avatar, at least one of the gods, the god kind of the movie, is the god of water, right? I got this little quote from the movie. I found it very interesting, to hear this articulated in the movie. The way of water has no beginning and no end. Sounds a lot like a description of God, doesn't it? The sea is around you and within you. The sea is your home before your birth and after your death. Our hearts beat in the womb of the world. Our breath burns in the shadow of the deep. The sea gives and the sea takes. Water connects all things, life to death, darkness to light. You can see God's being depicted all around you. And here's the truth of it. If God can be anything, then he isn't anything. God is not ambiguous. Idols let us shape God into whatever we want him to be. Third command, do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Right? Some of you have memorized this in the kind of language of do not take the Lord's name in vain. Right? Remember that one? The people that lived according to this command, they honored this command with the reverence and thoughtfulness of using God's name either in written or in verbal form. Eventually, they stopped using it altogether. They would not so much as even write the full expression of God's name. They'd use substitutes like Elohim, right? This is a common name for God, and it is sort of a generic kind of name for God found throughout the Old Testament. They'd use the name Adonai, which means my Lord, as a substitute, especially for the covenant name of God that they were reluctant to even speak. The command, I think, as we try to unpack what does this mean for us? How do I live this out in my life? Is that we should avoid using God's name in a way that is empty or meaningless. That we should be careful that there should be a degree of reverence and respect for the name of God and what it means. For us, it could carry the idea that there are prohibitions to not use references to God or to Jesus Christ, who has been revealed as the eternal God, in a way that is crass or disrespectful or meaningless. But I think that while that's all good and probably a prohibition that we should try to live up to, a bigger implication may be the way we associate ourselves with God's name. And so I'd invite us to ask ourselves this question: are we living up to God's name as God's people? As we think about God's name, right, oftentimes, especially those of us that have been or are part of a church, either this church or some other church, or we've been a part of a church, or we take on the name of Christian, perhaps, something like that. Like, what are we doing? We're associating ourselves, and by ourselves, I mean our lives, our thoughts, our behaviors, the way we treat other people, the way we live and operate in the world. We associate that with a name. As a Christian, you're associating yourself with the name of Jesus Christ. But Jesus, he tells us something very interesting. Matthew chapter 7, he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, and do many miracles in your name?'" Right? There are all these appeals that some are going to make these great appeals to the name by which they were associated, that perhaps they even leveraged in what they did in their lives. And Jesus says, "I will announce to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers.'" I think we have to take on the reality that, if we're going to call ourselves Christians, that being a Christian means something, right? It means something. We're associating ourselves with Christ. We're associating ourselves with God. And so are we, as God's people, are we actually living up to what it means to take with us the name of God? Or is it merely an association? Is it merely some label? Is it merely some appeal to something with which there is little alignment and congruence with our actual lives? And then the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. I'm going to gloss over this one because this one really bothers me because I am a disaster. I am one big hot mess when it comes to the Sabbath, as I bet most of you probably are as well. But God says here, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. I love that. Keep it holy, right? We've talked about what holiness is, right? Holy is not, it's really not much more than like something that is other, something that is separated, something that is different. When you think about holiness, this idea of keeping it holy, what does that mean? Does that mean that, we walk around with our shoes off, all day long and do other, certain things that just like, oh, it's holy, like probably not. But I think the Sabbath should be, like if we're living out this commandment, the Sabbath should be a day unlike every other day. It should be different. I get, for many of us, the Sabbath falls on a Sunday, and so there's a way in which it feels a little different because, maybe we don't go to work, right? The place where we go 5 other days of the week, and we punch a clock, right? Or we put our time in, and we produce something for which we get paid, right? And so Sunday's not like that. So we kind of fool ourselves into, I am treating this day like, I don't go to church every day. I go to church on Sunday. So in a sense, this day is different. But man, I just wonder, as great as it may be for us for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, depending on how long Josh happens to preach that day, it's wonderful that we give some space and opportunity for us to come together and to worship, but does this day really represent, us making a conscious effort to allowing this day to be unlike every other day? Or is the day more kind of defined by like the craziness of getting the kids ready for church, all bundled up and off to church, right? Which I get is a necessary, like if you've got kids, you got to do that, right? But there's a level of, of work and drama a lot of times that doesn't exactly set us off on the right foot when it comes to that day. Sometimes makes it difficult for us to enter into the house of worship in the kind of the right frame of mind because of the distraction of what, of the fight that happened in the car on the way to church that day. But then, like even after we're done here, well, what is the rest of the day? Is the day really an intentional use of this period of time to remind us of the purpose for which it was given to us? For one thing, I think the purpose is it reminds us that God is first, right? The Sabbath is an opportunity that reminds us God is first. Like if I truly treat this day unlike every other day, right? Like I'm not gonna get out of here and please don't hear this wrong, okay? Please don't hear this as like me trying to like lay a guilt trip on anybody. Like I said, I'm the top offender here. I just want to illustrate the idea of what we're so often doing. We walk out of here and we run off to the grocery store, do all our grocery shopping, right? Spend an hour and a half at the grocery store, getting our stuff together. That's work. A lot of us will go out to eat. I'm not saying it's wrong to go out to eat after church on Sunday. Okay, I don't want to screw up the local economy here, but we should think about that, like the part that we play into, if I could say it this way, ruining Sunday for everybody else, right? By the fact that, it's a great day to go to Lowe's. Like, how many of us are going to Lowe's today? How many of us are going over to Walmart? How many of us are going to be doing, things in the marketplace that are, in essence, contributing to the fact that other people, have to work. And I get, like, this is the society in which we live. Our economy just seems to be based on producing more and more and more and more and more. And I'm not trying to tell you what's right and wrong. I'm just sort of throwing the question out there. It's like, okay, well, what ought it to be? What is the intent for how, if God had his way within the framework of our society and in our lives, what would today look like? I think it would probably look a lot different than it actually does, right? So the Sabbath reminds us that God is first. Kind of the same way, for those of you that are givers and understand the concepts of like tithe and offerings, right? The tithe is the first 10% of what we make that we give back to God. We do that because we believe that that's what it means to be obedient to God with our finances. We give God the first 10%. We give it back to him on the first of the week. Do it again and again and again, every week. Like, that's just a habit of our lives. And what it is, it's not only obedience to his command to give him back the first 10%, it's also a symbol of the fact that he owns it all. Like, he has all of it. It's not just the 10% that's his. All of what I have is his. The 10% is just a symbol. It's just a me sort of agreeing with him that it's all his, right? And the Sabbath can be that when it comes to our time, how we spend, our time over the course of a week. Because a lot of people got this wrong. For generations and generations, people got the Sabbath wrong. They got it so screwed up. They thought it was all about how, in essence, we do this thing for God so that we will earn God's favor for ourselves. And then, Jesus comes on the scene. He turns the whole thing upside down. He says, listen, guys, the Sabbath wasn't made. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. God didn't create human beings in order that, we could fulfill the requirements of the Sabbath, God gets some satisfaction out of that. No, the Sabbath was actually made for us. It's God's gift to us. It's an opportunity for us to stop. It's an opportunity for us to say, enough is enough. I don't need to do anything more. Right? That's what the Sabbath is really all about. So the Sabbath is God's gift to us. In a moment, the band's going to lead us in a couple songs, and so we're going to have an opportunity this morning to practice some of this stuff. How many of you could use a little practice? And so let me just close our time together this morning with a reminder of these 4 commands and what they mean for our lives. Number 1, we need to make God the center of our lives. Number 2, we ought to come to church ready to worship, right? We were designed to worship. We've been prohibited from worshiping other gods, but that comes with the positive affirmation that we are then to worship with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength, the one true God. Number 3, live up to the name of the God you serve. Work to live a life that represents the love, the justice, the character of Jesus. And number 4, let the Sabbath become unlike any other day. Can we do that for a couple minutes before we all go our separate ways this morning?